Warning. The podcast you are about to listen to contains incoherent ramblings from an aging old fart who believes he is funnier than he actually is. Some listeners may find the amount of sarcasm and dry humor disturbing and traumatizing. This episode also contains material not suited for a young audience. Discretion is advised.
Before I get rolling, I wanted to mention an article that I wrote up that's on the website, and I don't always do a great job about promoting every single thing that I do because that kind of sucks. And speaking of sucking, I'm sure if you're an avid reader and you found yourself in a Facebook group, the majority of the posts they're like the same few books. You'll also see it's almost like the same people, or maybe they're just clones. And they'll ask something like, I'm only a half page into this book and I don't know if I can finish it. Does it get better or should I DNF it? And these are the kind of people that make me want to beat my head into a concrete wall. Make an adult decision, Carol. Read the book or don't. Why are you posting about it on this Facebook group? And another favorite post of mine is, my cousin saw a bird in the 4th grade on a field trip, and I want to read books about kids who like birds, but with a paranormal setting but it has to be in the Southeast. People that post crap like this are the same kind of people that are the first to stand up the second the plane lands. If you visit haveyoureadthispodcast.com, I wrote an article about how I used AI to get much better book suggestions, and you can avoid the typical crap that you see in some of these Facebook groups. Specifically, I use ChatGPT to get some different book suggestions based on things that I like, based on things that I wanted to read. And I included all of the prompts that I used to hopefully give you some ideas. This is not the end-all be-all guide to everything AI. This is just a different option for you to get recommendations rather than the same old people on Facebook. But back to the episode. When I first started reading, I would say I spent about 90% of the time with nonfiction. And in fact, I think there was a period where maybe I went a year and I just refused to read just anything fiction. I pretty quickly found my way into true crime. And I feel like I have read at least one book about every well-known serial killer that has ever lived. I'm still always looking for the next awesome true crime book. Every now and then someone will ask me about my favorites, and I thought this would be a great place to compile just a few of them, mainly so I could just tell people, hey, go to the podcast and look for this episode. I'm not sending you links for crap anymore. A quick disclaimer here, because in a way, it does feel strange to me to say, this is my favorite serial killer book, when this is literally about the worst of humanity. And also at the same time, it's about the worst part of some family's life. So just know that I am aware of that and the fact that there's probably something wrong with me for enjoying these books as much as I do. The first one I would recommend is Homicide, A Year on the Killing Streets by David Simon. If you don't know who David Simon is, he's the guy that's probably best known for creating The Wire, which was an HBO show that you probably should have already seen by now. I bought this book as it was recommended to me for its extremely accurate police work portrayal. This Simon guy basically embedded himself in Baltimore, great part of town, and he was with the city's homicide unit, and he is said to have been given like this unlimited, unprecedented access, and he's one of the first reporters to have ever been granted that. So that alone means that he should have access to material and content that not everybody is going to get, especially a reporter or an author. But this guy is really an amazing author. I don't know what it would have been like as a reporter to not only witness everything that he witnessed, but to find some kind of way to record it. And for those of you that don't know, I actually used to be a cop. And I don't know if I have ever read a book written by someone who was not a cop that captured what it was like to be a cop so accurately. I felt almost every part of this environment he was in from nearly every angle. And there are so many chapters that really stand out to me, but there's one where he discusses what it's like to be in court. And man, that brought back some memories. He just, all I can say really is that it's so accurate in some of these places. It's just eerie how good of a job he did. And just about every detail of being a cop, he was able to present so powerfully. So this is easily one of my all-time true crime reads. Not just a favorite true crime novel, but I would say this is one of my all-time favorites just in general. Next up, Confession of a Serial Killer, The Untold Story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer by Katherine Ramsland. And I feel like Dennis Rader is pretty much a household name to some degree. And in terms of serial killers, I feel most know at least his name. Like if you've read a lot of serial killer books, BTK or Dennis Rader should pop up and should be familiar in some level. This guy gave himself the nickname of BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, and Kill. And that nickname, as deprived as it is, really doesn't scratch the surface of just how evil this guy was. He was said to have murdered at least 10 people in Wichita, Kansas between 1974 and 1991. And he frequently would taunt police by mailing them letters. And I think he did the same thing with the media by mailing them stuff too. He suppressed all of these things, his desire, these evil urges for a little over 10 years, 13 years, something like that. And he resurfaced in 2004 and he started writing these letters again. And the book will go into details about some of the reasons of why he resurfaced. And for those of you that don't know how he was caught, it's a great story and it's kind of funny. And I don't want to ruin it for you, but it's that alone kind of, to me, I thought, man, no way. This guy, this guy was an idiot. And if you Google Dennis Rader, this guy looks like a manager at Home Depot. And sorry if you work at Home Depot and you're a manager and I just insulted you like that. But I'm trying to say, like, he looks average. If you saw this guy anywhere, I don't think you would think twice about it. You'd walk past him, wouldn't even know it. He was a church council president, and his appearance alone, like I said, it just wouldn't send up any red flags. The author of this book, Katherine Ramsland, put it together through jailhouse visits, phone calls, letters, and it's a wild ride, let me tell you. And his confession is actually out there on YouTube. I'll have to dig up a link and drop that on the website just so you can see how frightening he is, because I don't think you would see him on the street and be, there's a serial killer, but watching the confession, it kind of makes sense. So it's this weird vibe going on with this guy. A quick side note on him, his daughter wrote a book too, and it offered a totally different perspective of here's what it's like from the other side, and they didn't know what was happening with their father. And I'll drop the link to all of these on the website so you can go grab that one too, because it's Carrie Rawson wrote that. It's a really good book. Dips into her faith and belief and how she's tried to forgive or move past or just get beyond, like if that's even possible, but just move beyond knowing the fact that her father is a notorious serial killer. Next up, The Blood of Emmett Till by Timothy Tyson. Back in 1955 in Mississippi, there was a 14-year-old African-American boy who was murdered by some white guys. Till's murder was said to be part of a wave, and I believe this is a quote from one of the synopses, a wave of white terrorism in the wake of the 1954 Supreme Court decision that desegregated public schools. Till was accused of flirting with a white woman at a store. And yeah, that's it. I think when I first picked this up, I was expecting a crime to have taken place. That alone is mind-blowing, but I think it's also a testament to the amount of racism and hate that was prevalent then, especially in an area like Mississippi. This flirting, this was the terrible, just horrible so-called crime that he committed, and unfortunately, that was ultimately his death sentence. So the husband of this woman that he was said to have flirted with, along with this guy's half-brother, ended up finding Emmett Till at his great-uncle's house, and they kidnapped him. And he was beat, he was mutilated, and he was shot in the head, and he was dumped in a nearby river. And this book goes into so many details about the life of Emmett Till and digs further into what actually happened to him. I like the fact that there's some descriptions about him as a person and not just him as a pawn in the middle of the story. It talks about what justice looked like in 1955. It's a book about politics, race, hate, justice, and I feel like it might get overlooked in terms of true crime, because I think a lot of people, when they think true crime, and I did this for a long time, I thought serial killers for some reason. This is true crime, and I also think that this should probably be required reading for just about everybody. Next up, John Wayne Gacy, Defending a Monster by Sam Amirante. Again, we're back to serial killers. John Wayne Gacy is a household name. Obviously, he was a serial killer who raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in Norwood Park Township near Chicago. And you've probably seen images of this guy dressed as a clown, which is really just the creepiest thing ever. But I think what makes this book and story unique to me is that it was written by Gacy's defense attorney. And I mentioned earlier, used to be a cop. I didn't always hold defense attorneys in the highest regard. So when I first saw this, I thought, what kind of low-life human being would step up and say, oh, the guy that murdered 33 young boys, I really need to defend this guy. That alone was intriguing enough to me to say, let me at least give this book a shot. I just see what it has to say. I don't know how anyone could defend an inhuman monster like that. But Amirante makes it clear about his intent at the beginning of the book. And if I recall, he basically comes out and says, look, I'm not saying John Wayne Gacy is innocent. I'm not saying he's an angel. What I'm saying is that everyone is entitled to a proper defense. And so I thought, okay, I can get behind that just a little bit. I'm sure if I'm wrong about that, someone will come for me, but the chances are nobody will. Nobody's going to make it this far into the podcast. And, I could probably just start cussing and belching. Nobody would know. But anyway, the details of his crimes are not covered, I would say, with the specifics like the BTK book, which in some ways, I'm kind of glad. There's some of these things where I don't really need the details. However, the stories told here are just, they're so wild, and it just feels like fiction. And Gacy was eventually executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in 1994. And just overall, I thought Amirante did really good with, number one, how did he even get connected with somebody like John Wayne Gacy to have him reach out and ask to be defended? How did the whole process work? There's a lot of details about this case that I had no idea about. Like, what happened to the guy's house where all of these people were supposedly buried? There's a lot of information in this that I think makes it worthwhile to read. Did John Wayne Gacy ever admit to any of this kind of stuff? So it's told from a perspective that I probably wasn't expecting. So I think this would be a good true crime book to start off with. Next is Devil's Knot, the true story of the West Memphis Three by Mara Leveritt. In 1993, there were deaths of 3 8-year-old boys in West Memphis, Arkansas. And after that, detectives charged 3 teenagers who were alleged to be members of a satanic cult, and these 3 were charged with the killings. Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly. And these 3 actually spent 18 years in prison for the murders. Damian Eccles was said to be their ringleader, and he was actually sentenced to death. Now, all 3 of them were eventually released in 2011. This book goes into details about the case, and it's a case that just fascinated a ton of people. And it talks about what many believe was a very clumsy investigation. It talks about the lack of evidence, a jacked up confession, and a whole lot more. And this is just a wild case, and it felt really, there was at times where it just felt all over the place. And you can take a minute before you read this, and you can scroll on the West Memphis 3 Wikipedia entry, and you can see just tons of issues with this investigation and trial that came up. And there's several documentaries about this case, but naturally, I would say start with this book to just give you an idea of what happened, how it was handled in terms of law enforcement with the sentencing. And then you can go dig up information about Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, Jesse Miskelly, and see what has happened since the release, what caused them to be released in the first place. I can't imagine spending 18 years in prison for murdering 3 8-year-old boys if I didn't do it, especially with some of the background that's mentioned in this with the satanic cult kind of thing. This is just a wild one. And then again, like a lot of these other books, there's times where it's so strange that it feels like fiction when it's actually not. I had trouble narrowing down this list to just 5 books. And normally when I close these episodes out, I think, hey, I'm going to drop in, if you like these books, you'll also like this. I thought I'm going to skip that. And I only tried to narrow this down to 5, really just so I could have some kind of thing that said, here's the top 5 books. I don't know. Maybe that seemed better in a podcast title, and maybe it intrigued people to listen more. But if somebody came up and said, I'd like to read a couple true crime books. I know you've read a lot of books. What would you recommend? I think this is enough of a variety that would be a really good place to start if you haven't read these. If I listed all of the true crime books that I enjoyed, then this episode could easily be 4 hours. Nobody wants that. I mean, really, nobody wants it to be 20 minutes. Instead of tossing a few more in here at the end, it's just going to be easier for me to link them on the website. So head over there after you're done listening to this, or don't. Whatever, doesn't really matter at this point.